May I have your attention, please? This tape is on Egyptian art. Put in the first slide, please. Nothing has fascinated the archaeologist and the art historian more than the Egyptian culture. May I have your attention, please? This tape is on Egyptian art. Put in the first slide, please. Nothing has fascinated the archaeologist and the art historian more than the Egyptian culture. It predates history, and along with the introduction of hieroglyphics, it introduces a written record or a written history for us. Its style for over 3,000 years has not changed. It's a continuous thing, as moving as the Nile, which is the source of its whole life. As the snows come down from the mountains in southern Egypt, southern Africa, that overflows the Nile rivers every spring, that floods the banks and renews life each year, so goes the continuation of the Egyptian way of life. It is hard for us to realize how important this continuation of life affected the Egyptian in his way of life on earth, leading to his life in the hereafter, and into his art. Slide, please. The Nile overflows the banks each spring, bringing a fertile time that lasts through the season to harvest the crops, and then it returns to the arid sort of desert feeling. And as the sun rises each morning, the Nile rises each year, and this was the whole thought, the continuation of the Egyptian culture. The basics of Egyptian culture was founded somewhere around 3000 to 3300 BC. There are some evidences of cities, of some artworks predating that time, but we have a fairly good record of the rise of the pharaohs, of the kings that were divine people that established themselves as the head of the order, uniting the tribes along the Nile River that situated themselves close to the fertile banks. And by developing this high culture, unified the whole area around the Nile River within this one culture and this belief. It is also neatly divided for us into about 3 distinct periods. The first one being the Old Kingdom, which established the rules and the order of the Egyptian religion and of their culture. The Old Kingdom was from about 3300 BC to about 2100 BC. And within this period of time, we have the Great Sphinx, we have the pyramids, the massive tomb buildings, and the beauty of their art set down by one of the earliest of the architects, probably the first artist recorded, Imhotep, I-M-H-O-P-T-E-P. Slide, please. But it is along this mysterious culture, the ever-ending, never-ending styles and characterizations that permeate all their art through their tombs that we have learned about their life from their life after death. The Egyptian felt that within each person was a Ka, the spirit, and this spirit, when the worldly body died, carried on into another world. And it was the sole purpose of their whole life living toward this time when the Ka could be released from this earthly body and travel into the other world. And their whole life and their religion was based on this thought of death. And all the symbols that they used in their worshiping dealt with this death symbol. Slide, please. Slide, please. From the very earliest graves, which were holes dug in the ground and then to keep robbers from penetrating the grave, they piled bricks and stones and sticks on top of it that formed sort of a mound, that the idea grew, and it finally ended up in what was called a mastaba, which was a mound shape, and then a smaller mound was put on top of another mound for a more important person, and it eventually evolved into what was called in the earliest the step pyramids, and this is the one of King Zoser. Alongside of these step pyramids are the more massive graves of the divine person, the pharaoh, with a whole sort of funerary area with temple designed to worship before his death, and others of his sort of entourage that would be buried around their pharaoh. So it was sort of like a whole cemetery area where the main part of it was this sort of step pyramid that was a landmark. Imhotep designed this sort of mausoleum or tomb or worship place for King Zoser, and he established the forms used for the next 3,000 years, although he was a master at the beauty of proportion, using the papyrus and the lotus blossoms as decorative devices. His was a solid structure of sort of a post and lintel type thing, with the decorations just a pilaster attached to the sides of the buildings. No freestanding columns were used in his time. These came later. And it was with the freestanding, the columns that had to support the buildings, that the delicacy of the design was lost in gaining just pure support for the roof. Slide, please. Then finally, as these step pyramids developed and became bigger and bigger, they quarried the stone on the opposite side of the Nile River, right straight from the cliff rocks. And then at high Nile, they would float the huge 2-ton slabs across the Nile where they were finished and then finally placed into the massive pyramids of the later pharaohs. Slide, please. The size of some of the great pyramids of Egypt, of Khafre and Khufu, are tremendous when we start thinking of the size of like 2 million stones weighing 2 tons each, forming a pyramid that has a base of approximately nearly 800 square feet, or 13 square blocks within the base of the pyramid, rising to a height of maybe 480 feet at its finished point, and where the rough blocks were so carefully hewn and fit together that no mortar was used. They were just placed. It was solid masonry, with the exception of the inner chambers, the secret chambers where the pharaoh was buried. But if you can imagine these huge, solid monuments, this stable, triangular form, breaking over a very flat plain, it would be almost the height of our humble building in downtown Houston, with no other buildings around it. But of course it is a tall vertical structure, whereas these are massive triangular structures. Slide, please. The whole top of the pyramid now has crumbled away, so that there's about a 30 square foot area of flat surface on the top that cuts down its height by about 30 feet. But it was finished with a very smooth surfaced stone. Slide, please. During the early part of the Old Kingdom, carved directly from the rock in that area were the Sphinx, and this was the head of the pharaoh on the body of the lion. There were just a few of these made. There were a massive sort of a monument to the pharaoh, and the popularity dwindled rapidly, so that not too many of them were completed. Slide, please. They're in close proximity to the great pyramids of Khufu. These Sphinx acted as outdoor religious chapels or ceremonial places, where the mound of rock itself would be whittled away until the head shape was left, and then the massive pause for the definition of more stone or stonework, masonry, was applied as a finishing detail. But within these areas, there were giant, massive mausoleums and tombs circling all around the large pyramids that other families of high importance would be buried. Slide, please. Slide, please. The whole mountain of rock would be carved away, much like Mount Rushmore is being carved today. Slide, please. Slide, please. From the very earliest of pharaohs, the traditional pose was formed because the art formed a function or served a function. And this was the presentation of the figure of the person with slightly individual characteristics that showed all of the person, the dignity of the pharaoh, his divine position, along with all the attributes of his realm. There were two silhouettes. The first thing was the profile, then a full-face silhouette. There were several standard forms for sculpture. This one of Khafre, being seated as the pharaoh, carved with all the ceremonial garb, a very thin girdle of just a linen sort of skirt affair with the linen headdress, and the hawk god sort of encircling his head was the sun god, or the hawk was the symbol of the sun. The ceremonial beard that was attached is partially broken off in this piece of sculpture. But they had the standing pose, the sitting pose, and then later on in the lesser lights they had a cross-legged, seated pose. Slide, please. A later pharaoh's wife, Nofret, was done in limestone, and then, as in some of the lighter stones, they were colored in earth pigments. It's a very dignified, massive sort of solution to sculpture, where the block of stone is still very much in evidence, that it's the shape was sort of roughly hewn out, and then everything is closely hugged to the body. There is no motion. There is a massiveness, a quiet dignity to all of the Egyptian sculpture. Slide, please. Then, for some of the lesser figures that were important to the king's retinue, or the pharaoh's court, so to speak, were the scribes, the spear bearers, the heads of state, that, of course, would go along with the king in his afterlife, or the symbols of them within the represented pieces of sculpture. And for some of these, where the lasting quality was not so important, they would carve them out of wood and then cover them over with sort of a glued linen that then they could paint them up very realistically. When the Egyptian sculptor worked in wood, he felt a greater freedom in that he would attach the arms so that there could be a greater movement to the figure, a more lifelike stance. Slide, please. And these people would accompany the pharaoh on his journey into the afterlife. Slide, please. And certainly the beautiful presentation of Queen Nefertiti in limestone that's been painted. It's in the Berlin Museum. But the beautiful proportions, the sort of rhythmic quality to the facial features, that even though it is highly stylized, they do catch sort of an individualism to each person. Slide, please. And also Queen Nefertiti, but in a stone version. Slide, please. This was a Ka figure, ceremonial figure that would be placed in the tomb where the spirit could rest. This feeling of the home for the Ka, or for the spirit, was the reason for mummification in Egypt. that the figure had to be preserved, that the ka could not restlessly wander about the world. It had to have the figure to place itself after death. Slide, please. During the Middle Kingdom, which was from about 2100 BC to 1800 BC, the political empires was disjointed in Egypt, that it was more like a feudal system. The pharaohs trying to hold together the unity of the upper and the lower Nile. And it wasn't until the later empire that they took these, the development of the Middle Kingdom, where they took these step pyramids and then added colonnaded entrances to them, that in the empire this resulted, or finally grew, into the massive temples that lined the Nile, the Valley of the Kings along the lower Nile. These were built into the sheer rock cliffs that lined the Nile, and then these massive colonnaded entrances added to the front side. This is the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut. It served as a temple during her lifetime, and then her body would be buried here. Slide, please. But it's a beautiful pattern of rectilinear columns that hold the lintels that form the roof of the esplanaded affair that then goes back 200 feet into the rock cliffs, digging out a solid rock. Slide, please. And probably one of the most impressive tombs along the Nile is that of Ramesses II. This is the small chapel next to the tomb, the two-sided affair. Slide, please. And the massive sculptures of Ramesses II himself, 60 feet tall, 4 of them flanking the entrance to the tomb. In this area, where the waters of the backed up by the Aswan Dam are going to submerge these tombs, most of the major pieces of sculpture have been removed now, and the tomb itself placed in its watery grave. It will be about 60 feet underwater. Slide, please. Figures from the tomb of Ramesses II. Slide, please. Another major piece of architecture was the temple where worship was held. And within the Egyptian worshiping, it was sort of an enclosed area where the people themselves, the masses of the people, were not allowed to see the very interior works of their own religion. But they congregated within a large courtyard and beyond the walls, and you can see the massive scale of this building with the little people entering the door there that is approximately 35 to 40 feet tall, the doorway. And from that you enter into a large colonnaded area. From there, a smaller select group would then go into a colonnaded enclosed area, and then from that point into the treasury where the true worship process went on of only the select group of priests. Slide, please. This is looking down then on the interior courtyard of the Temple of Horus. Slide, please. And in the courtyard, the columns are massive in weight, the simple, basic post and lintel construction method of where 2 posts are erected and a beam is thrown across them. The capital tops of the columns in Egyptian art are based on papyrus or lotus blossom designs. Slide, please. Slide, please. In the Temple of Amun, the sort of bunched columns that resemble papyrus reeds bunched together with stories embossed on the design or in relief, are approximately 36 feet in diameter and about 72 feet tall. Slide, please. We gain a great insight to Egyptian way of life by the tomb paintings. And this is done on a plastered wall or a cemented wall with earth pigment colored renditions of the life of the pharaoh. Within the Egyptian painted tombs, we have things lined up according to tradition set in the Old Kingdom, where everything is placed along a base line, and much like our cartoon strips today of where little sections follow along in horizontal bands, it tells the life and the daily activities of the Pharaoh and the people within his court around them. To be able to show both silhouettes, which was very important to show the entire person on a flat surface, they took both the frontal and the side profiles of where the face would be in profile, the eye would be full face, the shoulders then turned in full face, with the hips then swiveled back in side profile, usually with one leg moving forward. Of course, in a twisted position like this, there could be just absolutely no motion, which gave a greater dignity to the Pharaoh. In lesser people, the working class, where they showed sort of working activities going on, where it was not so important to preserve the dignity of the person, then sometimes they would twist them or hide them with one arm sort of overlapping. But there's no background. The empty space was filled with the hieroglyphics that told the story. Slide, please. Rich color, nice flat pattern area, all space involved within the design. The Pharaoh then flanked by different gods behind him. Slide, please. This will be a whole section of different tomb paintings. Slide, please. Professional mourners. Slide, please. Gathering wheat. Slide, please. Again, harvesting. Slide, please. Slide, please. Ladies of the court. Slide, please. Slide, please. Placing of the mummy in the tomb. Slide, please. Slide, please. And the boat crossing into the afterlife, the Pharaoh with his wife, with the abundance of the wines, the grapes and the vines up above, and the hieroglyphics filling in the background, the boat neatly placed on a sort of zigzag pattern that would indicate the waves or the ripples in the water. With the mystery of the pharaohs and the great tombs, and we know with the wealth that they achieved with the gold mines from the southern part of their empire, it was a very wealthy one. And grave robbing was highly profitable even in the days of the Old Kingdom. And it wasn't until 1922 when Howard Carter discovered the unopened or unrifled grave of a minor pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, Tutankhamun, that we really had any idea of the magnitude of the wealth and the beauty of the craftsmanship and the work of the early Egyptians. Slide, please. Along the Valley of the Kings, in one of the funerary areas, Carter had been excavating for many years. Even at one point in the 19th century, the tomb of Tutankhamun had been entered and thought to be in a state of disarray and abandoned as if grave robbers had already been there. But in 1922, Carter proceeded on a little bit farther, and even though he went past this sort of area of disarray, these were the photographs that he took as the tomb was opened. Slide, please. Most of the things, the objects that had been gone through were piled up in heaps against the wall and partially obscured the door that was the secret door into the annex or antechamber of the tomb. Tutankhamun died in his 18th year of some disease. It's not known what. He was not murdered or killed, although the normal lifespan of people at this time wasn't very old. He still died a fairly young pharaoh before he had time to really establish anything within the empire. So even as minor as he was, we will see how elaborate his burial became. Slide, please. The objects that they placed with them in the tomb, and there was no thought of arranging them in room order, but they just took objects that he might be able to use in the afterlife. The beautiful little painted box on the floor we'll see later, it has a hunting scene of the Pharaoh on it. The two large ebony statues with gilded girdles and headdresses are guardians to the tomb door, and other little pieces of furniture that contain jewels, ornaments, objects of everyday living. Slide, please. And then to the entrance of the tomb, the boats that carry the spirit into the other world. Slide, please. And into one of the main chambers itself, the treasury, we see the king in the shape of a dog mounted on a pedestal sort of thing, wrapped in royal robes, which have decayed over the years. But the thing that catches our attention is the sort of squared object in the background, which is a gilt shrine. It's over a wood base and then sheet gold metal, hammered in designs covering the wooden frame, with the little maidens that seem to be holding hands on each side of it as guardians. Within this, you have an alabaster sarcophagus that holds the canopic urns that hold the vital organs of the young Pharaoh. The embalming or the mummification process is quite elaborate. It took 40 days to embalm the Pharaoh, so they had 40 days to prepare for his funeral. Some of the objects, of course, would come directly from his household, and some of them would have to be made especially for his burial. One of the main organs was the heart, and they felt that this is where the ka rested. Other main organs were the intestines and the liver. The brain was of absolutely no use to them whatsoever, but since all the internal organs had to be removed so that they could mummify the body, and the not wanting to disturb the head of the Pharaoh, the brains were removed through the nostrils, and then the empty cavity filled with drying salts and ointments. The different organs were then placed in the different jars and then placed within the large sarcophagi that then was placed in this gilt shrine. Slide, please. This is Professor Carter with the mummy covering of Tutankhamun. There were 3 cases covering the mummy. After the period of sort of drying out with the different oils and drying salts, the mummy was then carefully wrapped in layers of linen that then again layers of these drying salts would be added to. Then he would be completely dressed and placed in the position he was to be buried, and then elaborate wreaths of woven flowers and gold diadems and the crowns and jewels placed sort of on top of each other over his chest underneath different layers of these linens. He was then covered with a wooden coffin, which was then covered with another wooden coffin that was covered with a gold gilt coffin, and then the final mummy case was a solid gold mummy case representation of the king weighing 250 pounds. Now in present day gold prices, that would be worth several $1 million, just the mummy case alone. This was encrusted with different inlays and pastes and semi-precious stones. Slide, please. All of this was then placed in the stone sarcophagi. Slide, please. After the years of impact and sifting of dirt and everything, this is how the body of King Tutankhamun appeared upon discovery. Of course, most of these things were carefully removed. The wreaths of flowers that they were able to identify some of the things that were living at that time in history, and then each thing carefully removed. All of this went into the Cairo Museum. Slide, please. Beginning the journey was very important, the boat to carry him across into the other world. Slide, please. And there would be many varieties of the boats that would cross the great river, including little votive things of the body of the Pharaoh being carried across with servants around attending him. Slide, please. Slide, please. And these, of course, did not have to be life-size. They could be miniature models. The Spirit knew no size. Alabaster was a very favorite medium that they used, banded in gold. Slide, please. And then the mummy case coverings of King Tutankhamun. They have an individual characteristics of the face. The thicker lips, the straight nose. Of course, the eyes are stylized, probably by the makeup that he wore. The sort of large ears that were pierced that had other earrings attached. The inlay with different stones of coral, lapis lazuli, and enamels into the gold. Of course, this has been carefully cleaned and is now on display in the Cairo Museum. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. This was the diadem that he wore. It's beaten gold with inlays of lapis and coral. Slide, please. This was his throne that was in the chamber. It is over a wood form. It is beaten sheet gold with enamel coloring, especially in the back part, that shows the young king and his wife. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please.